Okay, so here we have part 2 of the Jefferson administration. So, the president appoints 2 friends of his to investigate this new property as well as Oregon country over here on the left side of the map. So, he chooses Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. They were friends of Jefferson. So they traveled up the Mississippi to the mouth of the Missouri, where they added a dozen more men before proceeding through some of the most rugged territory in North America. In the spring of 1805, they started in 1804, so in the spring of 1805, they add 2 new guides, a French fur trader and his remarkable wife, a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea. In appreciation for Lewis and Clark's help in delivering her baby boy, Sacagawea provided crucial assistance as a guide, translator, and negotiator as they explored the Mississippi River. Now, they do return home in the spring of 1806 because they had been forced basically to eat their dogs and horses. They did very well. They traveled some 28 months, covered 8,000 miles, saw the Pacific Ocean, returned with remarkably expensive journals that described their experiences and observations, detailing some 180 plants and 125 animals. Their splendid maps attracted traders and trappers to the region and led to the United States to claim the Oregon country, the entire Pacific Northwest, by right of discovery and exploration. Now, the Lewis and Clark expedition and the Louisiana Purchase strengthened Thomas Jefferson's already solid support in the South and West. In New England, however, Federalists panicked because they assumed the new states carved out of the Louisiana Territory would be dominated by Jeffersonian Republicans. So to protect their interests, they hatched a scheme. They want to link New York politically to New England by trying to elect Vice President Aaron Burr, that is Jefferson's ambitious Republican rival, as the governor of New York. He's still the vice president. So Burr chooses to drop his Republican affiliation and run as an independent. He loses very badly. He is quick to blame Hamilton, who had long hated him and done everything in his power to discredit him. So he charges him to a duel on a field of honor. Hamilton fires first, but intentionally misses. Let me get to this next slide for you. There you go. So Hamilton fires first, but intentionally misses as a demonstration of his moral principles, knowing full well that it might cost him his life. Now Burr shows no such things, and he shoots Hamilton in the hip. The bullet rips through his liver and lodges in his spine. Hamilton dies the next day. Burr, who is still the nation's vice president, is charged with murder, but he flees to South Carolina, where his daughter lives. But even while hiding out in South Carolina, he continues to scheme, Burr does. After this controversy kind of subsides, he tries to carve out his own personal empire in the West. What became to be known as the Burr conspiracy was hatched when Burr and General James Wilkinson, an old friend, plotted to use a well-armed force of volunteers to separate part of the Louisiana Territory from the Union. The plan was then to declare it an independent republic, with New Orleans as its capital and Burr as its ruler. Jefferson at this point is hell-bent on seeing Burr hanged, claiming that he had basically he had caused treason. Burr actually is captured and charged, but he is acquitted for lack of evidence. John Marshall, who was the Chief Justice, who was also Jefferson's cousin, had instructed the jury that a verdict of treason required an act of war. So, Jefferson is disgusted. And the president considered proposing a constitutional amendment to limit the power of the judiciary, even going as far as having Congress begin impeachment process of Marshall. In the end, however, he does nothing. With charges further pending, Burr skips bail and seeks refuge in England and then in France. He does return to America in 1812 and resumes practicing law in New York. But he's very sneaky that way. Now, over the course of his 2 terms as president, Jefferson, who was reelected in 1804, Jefferson reversed the policies of the Federalist Party by turning away from urban commercial development. He wants the United States to be the breadbasket of the world by exploring agricultural commodities without suffering the ills of industrialization. This comes at a cost. See, the most significant is the trimming of the federal budget because it comes at the expense of the military. Jefferson did not believe in maintaining it, but he does have to deal with the Barbary Wars. See, in the Mediterranean, there are pirates who are seizing American ships and demanding tribute from the American government. So Jefferson does end up having to pay to get American soldiers released. It's the first American conflict fought by Americans overseas. Now, while shrinking the federal government and the federal budget and reducing the national debt, Jefferson does sign the landmark bill that outlaws the importation of enslaved Africans into the United States, in part because Southerners had come to believe that African-born slaves were prone to revolt. So, this new law was to take effect January 8, 1808. For years, however, illegal global traffics in African slaves would continue. As many as 300,000 are smuggled into the United States between 1808 and 1861. But soon after, in the spring of 1803, after completing the sale of Louisiana to the United States, Napoleon Bonaparte does declare war on Great Britain. The conflict would last 11 years and eventually involve all of Europe. Most Americans want to remain neutral, but the British and French are determined to keep that from happening. During 1805, the spreading war reaches a stalemate. See, the French army controlled most of Europe, and the British Navy dominated the seas. So in May of 1806, Britain issues a series of declarations called the Orders in Council, which imposed naval blockades of European coasts to prevent merchant ships from other nations, including the United States, from making port in France. Although British leaders recognized American independence in principle, they are eager to humiliate the Republic by asserting their dominance over Atlantic trade. So soon, British warships begin seizing American merchant ships bound for France. Napoleon in 1807 announces that French warships will begin blockading the ports of Great Britain. The British respond by they will no longer allow foreign ships to trade with the French-controlled islands in the Caribbean. So you can see it's a back and forth. And American vessels are really stuck in a dilemma in the middle. They don't really know what to do. The British, the most for sailors, the danger on the high seas heightened by the impractice of impressment, whereby British warships stopped U.S. vessels, boarded them, and kidnapped sailors they claimed were British citizens. So, American merchant ships attracted British deserters because they paid more, right? So, but the British would often, they didn't even determine the citizenship of those that they impressed. So between 1803 and 1811, some 6,200 American sailors were impressed into the British Navy. Now, the crisis boils over on June 22nd, 1807, when the British warship, the HMS Leopard, stops the small U.S. vessel, the Chesapeake, 8 miles off the coast of Virginia. The Chesapeake captain refuses to allow the British soldiers to search his ship for English deserters, so the Leopard opens fire without warning. They kill 3 Americans and they wound 18. Now, the attack on the Chesapeake is an act of war and a national insult. The public is so angry that Jefferson could have declared war on the spot. But he decides a strategy of peaceful coercion, to force the British and French to stop violating American rights. So in late 1807, he convinced enough Republicans in Congress to cut off all American foreign trade. As Jefferson said, his choices were war, embargo, or nothing. So the Unprecedented Embargo Act stopped all American exports from prohibiting U.S. ships it prohibits U.S. ships from sailing to foreign ports to keep our ships and seamen out of harm's way. They mistakenly assumed that the embargo would force the warring European nations to quit violating American rights. It doesn't work. If anything, it upsets the American public. Americans raged at what critics called Jefferson's embargo. To enforce it, the embargo turns American politics upside down. Jefferson, once the leading advocate for reducing the power of the federal government, now finds himself expanding it in every aspect of the nation's economic life. In effect, the United States used its own warships to blockade its own ports. So, Congress finally votes 70-0 to end the embargo effect March the 4th, 1809, the day of Jefferson's second presidential term is supposed to end. Jefferson learns a hard lesson that many of his successors would also discover. A second presidential term is rarely as successful as the first. And he admitted, no man will ever carry out of that office the reputation which carried him into it. So, in the election of 1808, the presidency does pass to another prominent Virginian, the Secretary of State, James Madison, which I will be discussing with the War of 1812 on Wednesday.